Alright, so welcome again, everybody. This is the ASHA seminar number 9, talking about Atlantis. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about what Plato's writing the Timaeus has to say about it. And I think this is actually a perfect way to kind of get introduced to the original story of Atlantis. Now, I say original story because most people who've heard of Atlantis, they usually have heard about it through popular culture. So, for example, you have cartoons like what Disney put out, Atlantis the Lost Empire. You have Stargate Atlantis. I don't know if we have any sci-fi fans. Or even Assassin's Creed has a particular DLC where it talks about Atlantis. But these are all examples that popular culture gives us. But of course, there's a lot of literal, basically creativity involved in that, where they expound and embellish. They're really just having fun with the actual story. But what we want to do is figure out what is the actual story. So we want to look at Timaeus and what it has to say about Atlantis. So Timaeus, the writing, what is it? What is it? Well, there's an ancient Greek philosopher by the name of Plato, and he is known to have written a lot of different dialogues as they're known, one of which is the Timaeus. And a dialogue, what it has to do with is it basically puts these well-known characters, people in history together, and has them talk to each other about a particular subject. And in the case of Timaeus, it's a dialogue between Socrates, Critias, Timaeus, Hermocrates. We can call them Socrates and Hermocrates, however you want to say it, but it's between these four people in particular. First, let's just kind of briefly look at these different characters so we can kind of get some background. Plato is the author of the work. He is an Athenian philosopher who lived somewhere between 428 to 424, or 424 up to 348 BC. So apparently there's some discrepancies on what exact year he actually was born and died, but it's roughly that time frame. So Plato, he first was a student of the Pythagoreans in Italy. The Pythagoreans were a type of school of thought in philosophy and also geometry as well, and how the world works, at least how they figure the world works. And then later he became a student of Socrates. And then when he became old enough, he then also taught Aristotle. He's famous again for his philosophical dialogues and dialectic forms of writing. He's also the namesake for Platonic love and then the Platonic solids, which you see there's an image down at the bottom of Platonic solids, the different geometric shapes of the 5 basic elements, at least as they figured. It's also believed that Plato is related to Solon, who is another character mentioned in the Timaeus, and we'll get into Solon's role here later. But he's related to Solon through his mother's side of the family, and his mother is, I'm going to try and pronounce this, Perictione, who is also the niece of Critias. Critias is one of the other people in the dialogues. So there's a lot of relationships here, and that also kind of helps the plausibility of the story and how he may have gotten the story of Atlantis. The other character is Socrates, Athenian philosopher from 470 to about 400 BC, and of course his most prominent student was Plato. No known writings from Socrates, so really the only thing that we have to go on who he was through other people, including what Plato wrote of him, and of course, what he wrote in Timaeus of Socrates. Because of that, we don't know for a fact that some of the things that Plato writes Socrates as saying in the dialogue is actually what he said. So we're just going to have to take it as it is, right? Basically whatever Plato says, and just kind of keep that in mind. Then we have Critias. He's an Athenian political figure and author 460 to 403 BC, first cousin of Plato's mother, and was also an associate of Socrates. It's also important to note that his great-grandfather, Socrates, was a close friend with Solon. And as we'll see here later, his great-grandfather played a role in passing down the story down to Critias. Timaeus of Leucre, this is the character that the piece is named after. It's interesting to note that there are other pieces as well where Plato titles it based on one of the other characters in the same dialogue, but of a different time, basically a different discussion. It's kind of interesting how he does it, because it's not like he's trying to do it from their perspective each time, but that's just kind of how he titled it. Either way, Timaeus of Leucre, 5th century aristocrat, public official. So basically he's from the colony of Leucre, which if you see the map on the bottom left, is in the southern part of Italy, and that is also where the Pythagorean school was. So that's where he met Plato. That's how Timaeus and Plato know each other, is through school. After school, then he served in public office, and then later moved to Athens. His actual existence, however, is debated by scholars, because Plato's account is pretty much it. There are other references as well, but they borrow from what Plato says as far as who Timaeus was, at least this particular character. In some sources he's used as a fictional character. But on the other hand, there are other sources that explicitly say that Timaeus definitely met Plato here at that school. So that's where I'm getting that information from, at least. Some people think he's a fictional character. Some people think that because of people corroborating Plato's story, that he actually did exist. There's also a theory that maybe Timaeus was the Pythagorean Philolaus, if that's the right way to pronounce it, who lived in the 6th century. You'll see my reference down at the bottom. That's something that we can look at later, but I'm going to move on. The next character is Hermocrates. He was a Syracusan general, 5th century to 407 BC. Syracuse, so again, this is southern Italy, is where he's from. He's famous for leading armies and battles against the Athenians. Athenians meaning Athens, Greece. So basically the Athenians, they were trying to invade, assert their dominance in Italy. Hermocrates, of course, being from Italy, helped in the fight against them, and as part of the Peloponnesian War. It's interesting to note, though, that most of his exploits, he actually was not very successful in battle. So I find it interesting that Plato uses him in his dialogue, but nonetheless, he does have kind of the background, at least with when it pertains to wars between Athens and other nation states. So I think that's why it's probably relevant. That's why he uses him. He was a famous general, and he was in many battles. Of all the battles I could find him in, there was only one where he actually succeeded. Solon. So this is actually probably the most important character of Timaeus. Not Timaeus, it's actually Solon, I think. So he's an Athenian statesman, lawmaker, poet, 635-60 BC. So that means he lived at least a couple hundred years before Plato and all the other characters. He's also considered one of the 7 ancient Greek sages, basically a very wise person. He led efforts to reform the Athenian government and culture in order to bolster democratic principles, improve economic conditions, mitigate greed, corruption. He was a very, very influential lawmaker. He really helped to improve ancient Greece. That's why he's well renowned. In fact, if you see the picture on the left, this is actually a statue of him in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. So he's so important. In fact, especially a lot of the laws that he brought about, he's remembered in our nation's capital. I could spend all day on talking about what he did, but we're going to keep moving on. Basically, once he got these reforms done, part of the new constitution that he helped to create was supposed to last at least 10 years. That way then he just decided to leave it to the politicians, and he just left. He left Greece and decided to just visit around the Mediterranean. It is believed during this time that he actually visited Egypt. And it's in Egypt where he hears of the story of Atlantis. So that's where it's important. Now, he would have stayed longer if it weren't for the Athenians forgetting about how to manage themselves with this new constitution. There was a lot of disagreements, so he ended up leaving early to try and correct them once again. So in the dialogue, it's actually Critias who tells about Solon's story. Of course, so Timaeus, it starts out them talking about what is the perfect government, this and that. That's when Critias says, I've got a story about an example of what could make, the perfect government. And he wants to use an example that he had heard from his grandfather, who heard it from his father, who heard it from Solon. So there's a lot of passing down from person to person. But basically it starts with Solon. He goes to Egypt. He talks with the ancient priests there, more specifically in the city of Sais. If you see the map down in the bottom of the middle, off of the River Nile. Apparently there they had all kinds of records of their ancient past. Remember again, Solon was living about 600 BC. So that's when he went to Egypt, 600 BC. At least according to Timaeus, at that time, they had records that went back thousands of years from their time. So I'm going to go ahead and just read this excerpt real quick so you can actually see what that part says, so you can see it for yourself. So Critias says, "Then listen, Socrates, to a tale though strange, is certainly true, having been attested by Solon, who is the wisest of 7 sages. He was a relative and dear friend of my great-grandfather, Socrates, as he himself says, many passages of his poems. And he told the story to Critias, my grandfather." Just real quick, Critias, his grandfather's name was Critias, "who remembered and repeated it to us. There were of old," he said, "great and marvelous actions of the Athenian city, which have passed into oblivion through lapse of time and the destruction of mankind. And one in particular, greater than all the rest." That part itself, I think, is very interesting. He's saying that there was a story passed down to him through the generations that originally came from the Egyptians, talking about their ancient capital, basically what was before Athens. The only reason why the Greeks didn't know about it is because of calamities, destructions, basically, of civilization, at least in their area. So I'll continue. In the Egyptian delta, at the head of which the river Nile divides, there is a certain district which is called the district of Sais, and the great city of the district is also called Sais, and is the city from which King Amasis came. To this city came Solon, and was received there with great honor. He asked the priests who were most skillful in such matters about antiquity, and made the discovery that neither he nor any other Hellene knew anything worth mentioning about times of old. For those that don't know, when it says other Hellene, it's talking about Greek people, basically. So you've heard of like Helen of Troy, for example, probably like the Hellenic Empire. Whenever it's talking about that, Hellene is referring to Greece. Critias is just talking about how Solon went to the priests, learned something completely new that none of the Greeks had any idea about, and the reason being because of constant destructions and calamities. Corrington is asking, can you tell us more about the record keeping from the location in Sais? So it's like the Library of Alexandria. Yeah, I could definitely, and I think one of the other following slides might go into a little bit more. But you're basically right. At least according to Timaeus, the character Critias goes on to say that, yeah, these priests had records going back thousands and thousands of years. Now, they probably kept their records a little bit differently than the Library of Alexandria. And I'm just basing that, from videos I've seen of those areas. They like to put a lot of their writings on hieroglyphs and stuff. I know that they also did use papyrus, but more than likely they would try and etch something like that on hieroglyphs just to try and keep it more permanent. That was something that was extremely important to the Egyptians, was the permanence of their history. It's a very good question. One other interesting thing to note, well, there are a lot of interesting things to note. Probably the first big thing that I noticed that it talked about was the first man. Of course, my immediate thought is, are they talking about Adam? Like from the story of Adam and Eve? I'm going to let you all kind of think about that, but obviously this is just a little bit of speculation. I'm going to read the text and then talk a little bit about what it's saying here. He began to tell about the most ancient things in our part of the world, about Pharaonius, who is called the first man, and about Niobe. It's saying Pharaonius and about Niobe. You notice these names, they're actually very much Greek sounding, and it's because they are Greek names. Now, why would the first man and this other person that might be somehow associated with the first man, why did they have Greek names? Some of the other text kind of talks about how these names are not the exact names of these people from so long ago, because these names have been translated into many languages over time. They're Greek names because when Solon received these names and began to retell them, he used Greek names so that they were a little bit more familiar to the Greeks, to his audience. So yeah, he began to talk about Pharaonius, the first man, and about Niobe, who maybe is Eve, who knows, and after the deluge, of the survival of Dicleon and Pyrrha, and he traced the genealogy of their descendants and reckoning up to the dates, tried to compute how many years ago the events of which he was speaking happened. Thereupon one of the priests, who was of great age, said, "O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are never anything but children, and there is not an old man among you." Solon in return asked him what he meant. "I mean to say," he replied, "that in mind you are all young. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age. And I will tell you why. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water, and of lesser ones by innumerable other causes. There is a story which even you have preserved, that once upon a time Pathon, the son of Helios, having yoked the steeds in his father's chariot, because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burnt up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt. Now this has the form of a myth, but really signifies a declination of the bodies moving in the heavens around the earth, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth, which recurs after long intervals. At such times, those who live upon the mountains and in the dry and lofty places are more liable to destruction than those who dwell by rivers or on the seashore. And from this calamity, the Nile, who is our never-failing Savior, delivers and preserves us. When on the other hand, the gods purge the earth with a deluge of water, the survivors in your country are herdsmen and shepherds who dwell on the mountains. But those who, like you, live in cities are carried by the rivers into the sea. Whereas in this land, neither then nor at any other time does the water come down from above on the fields, having always a tendency to come up from below, for which reason the traditions preserved here are the most ancient. That's a lot. I know it's a lot of text, so we're going to try and unpack it real quick. The priest is telling Solon that there have been many great calamities throughout history, some of water, some of fire. And in fact, he's telling them, literally, you have myths that are actually based on historical occurrences. He's talking about how the Nile is actually kind of an oasis to these calamities, and that's why they've been able to preserve such ancient history compared to the Greeks. I don't know about you guys, but I think that part is amazing. This is actually a picture, it's depicting Sodom and Gomorrah, but it's a very similar instance. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is that the city was so overwhelmed with corruption and sin that God decided he destroyed it with fire. Now, of course, a lot of archaeologists would say, well, it's possible that maybe there was some kind of volcano. Then again, when you look at the area where Sodom and Gomorrah probably was, there's really not that much volcanic activity. So another possibility would be Asteroid Strike, which actually, I'm going to go back a slide, fits in with something that the priest says. When he's talking about that myth of Pathon and the son of Helios, who basically crashed his father's chariot and burnt up all that was on the earth, he was saying that was actually the declination of bodies moving in the heavens around the earth. That seems pretty explicit to say that, like meteorites, right? Asteroids that are going around in space eventually hit the earth. That's a very good explanation, I think, for one of the many calamities that they are referring to. Another one would be the Great Flood. The priest mentioned that there were actually many floods, So we all know the story of Noah and the flood. This story kind of takes it from another perspective. It isn't just something that we get from one particular text. This is something that a lot of different cultures have talked about, and there are plenty of records of it from the Egyptians, and not just Plato's work here, for example. Another thing that the priest explains is that these records actually date back before the Great Flood. So here's the excerpt from the text. As for those genealogies of yours, which you just now recounted to us, Solon, they are no better than tales of children. In the first place, you remember a single deluge only, deluge meaning flood, but there were many previous ones. And the next place, you do not know that there formerly dwelt in your land the fairest and noblest race of men which ever lived, and that you and your whole city are descended from a small seed or remnant of them which survived. And this was unknown to you because for many generations the survivors of that destruction died, leaving no written word. For there was a time so long before the great deluge of all, when the city which is now in Athens was first in war and in every way the best governed of all the cities. There are a lot of things to get from that. Multiple deluges, multiple floods. Now, does it mean multiple global floods? It doesn't say global. So it could be that there are many localized floods or many regional floods, and maybe the Great Flood could have been the global flood that a lot of other civilizations also have stories about. He also goes on to say that there were survivors of the flood, but they had not maintained their form of writing. Basically, he's saying that any kind of form of writing they may have had, they no longer had. And so they instead relied on oral tradition. That's his explanation as to why the Greeks don't know about all these ancient histories that the Egyptians know about. And then he says there is an old pre-Athenian city from before the flood. So Athens, of course, being in Greece, he's saying that there's actually a city that was there before the current Athens was found. He says, she founded your city, she being Athena. Athena is the Greek goddess of wisdom, handicraft, and warfare. Well, where Athens gets its name. So the priest goes on to say that the original Athens was founded by Athena, and that she founded this city 1,000 years before ours, before the Egyptian civilization, receiving from the earth and Hephaestus the seed of your race, and afterwards she founded ours, of which the Constitution is recorded in our sacred registers to be 8,000 years old. So, as touching your citizens of 9,000 years ago, I will briefly inform you of their laws and of their most famous action. What the priest is saying is that this ancient Athens was 9,000 years before his time. So once again, this is about 600 BC when Solon was in Egypt. And if this ancient Athens existed 9,000 years before that, we're looking at 9,600 BC. The end of the last ice age was roughly 10,000 BC. So pretty much right around that time. I think that part, obviously a lot of people have a hard time believing it, especially archaeologists, mainstream archaeologists, because our text, stuff that we learned in school, was that ancient Sumeria was the first main civilization to hit the stage on the earth. They only date back to about 3,000 to 4,000 BC, right? Some of the earliest times. Same goes with the Egyptians. They don't go back nearly as far back. However, there are new archaeological findings which is making this more and more plausible. One of which is called Göbekli Tepe, very hard name to pronounce, I know, located in Turkey. It's like Stonehenge on steroids. It was only discovered because of a Turkish shepherd wanted to kind of do some clearing around a mound and stumbled across parts of a ruin that was buried in the mound. It eventually got the attention of archaeologists. They began digging and they found tons of concentric circles, hinges with hieroglyphs, or not Egyptian hieroglyphs, but pictographs, if you will, carved into the rocks. And they ended up dating it back to, I want to say it was, 12,000 years ago. So the fact that they had that kind of construction back then, as far as I could tell, it wasn't a livable city, but still, the fact that they were able to put these rocks together and do all those things makes it a little bit more plausible that there were more advanced construction techniques even back then. He goes on to talk about how Athens actually ended up coming under attack by another ancient empire, which would be the Atlantean Empire. According to the excerpt I have here, says, many great and wonderful deeds are recorded of your state, the ancient Athenian state, in our histories. But one of them exceeds all the rest in greatness and valor. For these histories tell of a mighty power which unprovoked made an expedition against the whole of Europe and Asia. Now, Asia at that time, just for context, they're really just talking about Turkey and the Middle East, because back then that was considered Asia, and to which your city put an end. This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean, where in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits, which are by you called the Pillars of Hercules. Maybe some of us refer to the Pillars of Hercules. More than likely, and I'm always saying more than likely, that actually refers to the Straits of Gibraltar. But it's basically the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together, and was the way to other islands. And from these, you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent, which surrounded the true ocean. For this sea, which is within the Straits of Hercules, the Mediterranean Sea, is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance. But that other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a boundless continent. So kind of an interesting depiction there. It's talking about how, he's talking to Solon, just saying, you understand the Mediterranean Sea as a great sea, but actually there's the Atlantic Ocean just beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, the Pillars of Hercules, and that's where this other ancient empire, which is Atlantis, exists on islands. And then beyond the islands is an even bigger continent. Could it be the Americas he's talking about? How do they know? A lot of speculation we could go on there, but I'm going to leave it at that for now. So here's an ancient map. Can be a little confusing at first, but it is upside down. North is actually down, south is up. To the left, you see Africa, and it has Hispania or Hispania, the Straits of Gibraltar, the Atlantic Ocean, and you see they put America on the far right. So obviously this is only a few hundred years old, because America wasn't named America until Vespucci Amerigo went over there and mapped it out, and it's like, hey, yeah, this is a whole new continent, and then they named it after him. This is kind of their idea of what they thought maybe Atlantis looked like. They had this massive island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Look at another map. So as you can see, they have the Pillars of Hercules right here. I don't know why, but there is some doubt about it for some reason on the internet, but I think it's undisputable. These have to be the Pillars of Hercules, just because the priests also refer to the inner sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the outer sea beyond it, the Atlantic Ocean. And again, the priest was saying that Atlantis would have been on the outside, to the left or to west of the Pillars of Hercules. I bring that up because some theories were that maybe Atlantis exists over in Crete, which is south of Greece on the east side of this map here. Some would say that it could be anywhere else in the Mediterranean, but it would not match what Timaeus is saying. And Timaeus is the oldest known source that we have of the story. There were allegedly other sources that these writings loosely refer to, but it is assumed that those other sources were most likely lost during the burning of the Library of Alexandria. So very unfortunate. I think it's still possible that we might find other sources though, because there is the example of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't know if you guys have heard about those, but basically those were discovered, it's been a few decades at least, but around the Dead Sea in Israel, and they were some of the oldest copies of biblical text that has yet to be discovered. And what it did is it actually helped to substantiate the writings a little bit more and place it further back to the actual Bible time frame, especially around the New Testament. I think that's the fact that that was discovered gives a little bit of glimmer of hope that there's a possibility we might find some new stuff, some stuff that hasn't been discovered yet on Atlantis. So, but here's a modern map of what it looks like. There's really not much on this map. If you go further west, there are islands. There's also been some recent talk about how Atlantis actually could be off the southern coast of Spain, close to Portugal. Some archaeologists have found what looks to be an ancient site that's been inundated by the sea, and it's kind of very marshy and everything, but there seems to be maybe something that might have been concentric circles. For those that don't know, the city of Atlantis is described described to be set out in concentric circles of 3 rings of land and like 2 rings of water, something like that. I would get more into the detail of that later, but I'm actually going to save that for another part later just because there's just so much here. So we're going to continue on with the story. Like I was saying, the Atlantean Empire, as the priest tells it, they decide that they are going to strike down the Athenians. Now, they've already kind of conquered a lot of the known world at that time, as described by the priest. And you see here on the map kind of what I'm looking at. The blue areas roughly kind of say where that empire may have had its influence or its territorial boundaries. Clearly, Greece is already on there. So I can only assume then, based on the text, the people of Athens decided to fight against it. So in the text it says, "Now in this island of Atlantis there was a great and wonderful empire, which had rule over the whole island and several others, and over parts of the continent. And furthermore, the men of Atlantis had subjugated parts of Libya within the columns of Hercules, the Mediterranean Sea, as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Germania." That word, not quite sure what that references to, but more than likely we're looking at a good portion of Europe. "This vast power gathered into one, endeavored to subdue at a blow our country and yours and the whole of the region within the straits. And then, Solon, your country shone forth in the excellence of her virtue and strength among all mankind. She was preeminent in courage and military skill, and was the leader of the Hellenes, the Greeks. And when the rest fell off from her, being compelled to stand alone, after having undergone the very extremity of danger, she defeated and triumphed over the invaders, and preserved from slavery those who were not yet subjugated, and generously liberated all the rest of us who dwell within the pillars." So it does say that there were some not yet subjugated. So obviously there were some areas that Atlantis had not quite conquered. So Athens, as he says, was actually the leader of the Hellenes. Basically what that would mean is you have Athens, which is a city-state, kind of a sovereign state of its own, leading a coalition of other city-states, nations, joined together in a common cause to fight off the Atlanteans. After having undergone the very extremity of danger, that tells me that they were losing for a long time, but in the end they fought them off and won, and was able to liberate all those who dwell within the pillars. So basically all the nations in the Mediterranean Sea. Doesn't sound like a very easy feat. In the context of Timaeus, Critias was using this as an example of how a just and moral nation can triumph over an extremely imposing adversary. Because again, this is supposed to be like a political piece. So he was using victory in war as kind of an example of what could signify a government being a really good or nearly perfect government. But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes. So after the defeat of Atlantis, there were earthquakes and floods. In a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men and a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis, in like manner, disappeared in the depths of the sea. For which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. We've heard about how Atlantis sank into the sea. What's interesting is he goes on to say that it is for this reason that that part of the sea where Atlantis sank is impassable and impenetrable, basically by naval vessels, because it is now a shoal of mud, or basically an area of extremely shallow water caused by the subsidence of the island. So in a way, he's basically saying, at least in Solon's time, around 600 BC, what's left of Atlantis is basically like a sandbank or a shoal, just shallow water, hardly anything left. Not very promising when it comes to archaeological finds. Maybe there is something still left, maybe buried. That also kind of gives more credence to the idea that it might be in southern Spain. Again, they think they found what looks to be ancient ruins in shallow water. So in summary, Timaeus is generally a piece about politics and philosophy. Uses the story of Atlantis, its war with the Athenians, as a morality tale. It's interesting to note that Critias had emphasized that it's actually factual, that it's actually based on a true story. There are many parts in the text where it says that, and some of the other characters like Socrates and the others, they ask him, it's like, so you're saying this is a real story? And he keeps saying over and over again, yeah, this is at least based on what I had been told, or my grandfather was told by Solon, who was told by the priest. Again, he wanted to use that example because the Athenians, he wanted to show that the Athenian government, as it was then, was a more perfect government. And because of that, they were actually able to defeat the Atlanteans, who are a much more powerful adversary. A lot of interesting details on how the story was passed through the ages, as we heard. First from the Egyptian priests, from their archives, then on to Solon, who brought it back to Greece, and then he passed it down through poems. He told one of those poems to Critias' great-grandfather, Dropides, who then passed it down throughout the generations. Presumably, eventually passed it down to Plato, and that's how he wrote it into the dialogues, because we saw earlier that it is a retelling of a retelling of a retelling. It is very possible that there's kind of a game of telephone going on. That's important to remember when it comes to just trying to figure out how factual the story of Atlantis is. It probably is based on some kind of historical event in order for it to get passed down. There's so many other accounts of the other things that the priests talk about, like the Great Flood, the deluges and everything. There are many other ancient civilizations that talk about it. I think it's worth investigating further. The Temple of Sais, since Solon's time, has itself endured a deluge of sorts. It is actually mostly in the Nile, inundated by the water and surrounded by crocodiles. Don't know if that's something that people can look into at some point. There's still a slight possibility that it might still be recorded on one of the walls in hieroglyphic. There were also the poems that Solon was said to have written and passed down. Don't know if there are any accounts of that. Require further research. From what I could tell, though, a lot of those accounts are lost. Another interesting thing to note is just that it talked about who could be Adam and Eve and Noah. Again, these are other stories that are mentioned, like in the Bible. Other civilizations that talk about it too, even the ancient Sumerians talk about it. So the fact that they reference other mythological stories or stories of that nature kind of gives more credence to, historical fact, basically the idea that it could actually be based on. If you do want to read Timaeus, if you're interested in that, go right ahead. There's plenty of it. So there is more to come. I know you're probably thinking, but there's a whole lot more to Atlantis. The concentric circles outlet design and everything like that. Yeah, there is more. It is in the other piece written by Plato called Critias. And of course, it's going to focus more on Critias' story of Atlantis. So be excited for that. I want to do it justice. That's why it's not in here just yet. I'm going to take questions and comments. So we got a lot of comments here, and I'm sure I missed a lot. Islands and ports can be submerged by the ocean in as little as 30 years, let alone 9,000 years. Very true. I don't know if you guys have heard, but there are islands even today, famous islands that a lot of celebrities like to go to, like Tahiti, the Maldives. Because of global warming, the oceans are rising, and those islands are disappearing. It is definitely a real thing. The city experienced a major catastrophe like volcanic severe tectonic activity, then submerged, coated with coral growth, sea life. Might be tough to find remnants. Very true. Yeah, there's so many reasons why it would be tough to find remnants. Thousands of years have gone by. First Greek author to mention the Tyrrhenians is the 8th century BC by the Greek poet Hesiod. In his work, he merely described them as residing in central Italy alongside, thank you for that. Okay, so not the major part of Europe that maybe that map was depicting. It was going up into France and Germany and up to England. So it's basically saying probably just maybe northern, or it says central Italy. I would consider that part of the Mediterranean, but I guess the priests of Egypt don't necessarily. Origin is uncertain and apparently not Greek. It has been hypothesized that the Teresh, who appear among other sea peoples, and a number of, and it cuts off. We could do a whole slideshow on the sea peoples. I'll just tell you that. Just briefly, the sea peoples, the Egyptians tell of people that came and invaded Egypt at one point and destroyed a lot of their stuff. And the only thing they referred to them as was the sea peoples. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions from 1200 to 1150 BC, maybe the same people as the Tyrrhenians. I find it interesting that it's documented that these people, just one of many that Atlanteans ruled over, were of unknown origins and classified as water people. Now, again, the priests say that the Atlanteans ruled over pretty much the entire Mediterranean Sea and many lands in the Atlantic. Grant asks, have you looked at the city of Helike? I have not. So west of Athens. Corrigan also mentions any currency and metals would be gone, but jewels, carving, sculptures may still be found in the sea after that amount of time. Sure, it's possible. So Grant is coming back to Helike. He is asking if I looked into it. He says the coastal city of Helike, located on the Gulf of Corinth in Greece, was a seat of great power of the 12-city Achaean League. It was also a major center for the worship of Poseidon, the god whom Plato described as the patron of Atlantis. That's right. Like Plato's lost city, Helike featured a prominent and famous statue of the god. Yeah, that's a very good point, Grant, and that's something I'll definitely go more into in the next seminar, only because Timaeus doesn't really mention about Poseidon, but Critias does. That he's the patron god of Atlantis. And you're right, a lot of other Greek cities also had the patron god Poseidon. There's a reason for that too. Hopefully we'll get more into that in Critias, but I'll just summarize it here. It said that Poseidon basically founded the city of Atlantis, much like how Athena founded the ancient city of Athens. I can see many vacations to the Mediterranean in our future to learn more about this, about an ancient past that is not taught in our schools. Alright guys, FTH, seek truth, live by the truth.